them out. The Company of Wolves. Rated R.
Company of Wolves is magical. It takes Little Red Riding Hood and turns it into something really provocative and Freudian. It has to do with red dresses and menstrual bleeding and werewolves. In this one, the wolf head emerges out of the human mouth, and that transformation takes place in a totally different manner than you've seen before. It's still makeup effects, and it's still puppetry and change-o-head type technology, but in a totally different way. It's a really special movie that not enough people have seen.
Company of Wolves was I thought, a really interesting movie. I was a little miffed when Neil Jordan said he didn't want to make a piece of shit like The Howling. So it kind of prejudiced me a little bit. But it's a good movie.
Coming soon for you, The Stuff.
The Stuff, which is a blob movie, basically, is about killer yogurt. that eats you. It manages to be hilarious and scary at the same time.
Look out! Don't get none of it on you! Keep back!
It's a comment on consumer society, except you're not consuming the stuff out of the can. The stuff out of the can is consuming you. I mean, it's terrific.
If you want to make a movie about American industry producing products that poison the public, that would be a wonderful movie, but nobody would go to see it. Now you take the same idea and you make it ice cream that they're putting out in the marketplace that consumes you from within. And now it's an entertainment movie. You sell your message at the same time as you entertain. The whole idea of our picture was that people go out and buy this product and eat it and become addicted to it and love it. So it was about everything else that's addictive. Michael Moriarty was remarkable in the first picture we did together, which was Q, and nobody could have been better. So naturally, I would want to work with him again. We did the same thing as Fred Astaire in that famous dance routine where he danced on the ceiling. They turned the room, we turned the room 360 degrees upside down. The only difference is that in this one, it was on fire. I beat the stuff with a stick. When it didn't want to do what I told it to do, I didn't care. When no one was looking, I give it a couple of whacks, and that got its attention, and it pretty well did what it was told after that, With actors, it's one thing, because they have feelings and and they have agents and they have lawyers. But with the stuff, it was totally mine. I could beat the shit out of it.
The dead shall have their day. Day of the Dead.
My father was one of the first horror hosts in the country in Pittsburgh. His name was Chilly Billy, and he had a show called Chiller Theater and Night of the Living Dead. My father was in it. George was a master, and he was always ahead of his time. As everybody says, a giant of a man, a tall teddy bear. He was approachable. He loved actors. He gave us freedoms. Sarah was holding it tight, trying to hold it together. She had to hold it together. She was a scientist trying to figure this out, had to deal with all these jerk guys in the military.
Oh yeah, we forget to write them up sometimes,
You've got to write them up. It's essential. Can't you get that through your thick skull?
She had warmth and compassion, but mostly you don't get to see that. You see her harder exterior. At the time, people were trying to compare Day of the Dead to Dawn of the Dead, and it was a completely different movie. They were very disappointed, and it was too talky, they would say, or not enough gore, although at the end, Tom Savini, his crew, did a beautiful job. The practical special effects on Day of the Dead are remarkable. Greg Nicotero was a young guy on the show, and he was like 19 years old, but obviously very talented.
We used to talk to Washington all the time. They could hear us then.
Dawn of the Dead changed my life forever, just in terms of never knowing where George was going to take us.
Let's just walk through it once. Action!
I was basically Tom's assistant, so I ran the department for him and ordered all the supplies, hired the crew, all that kind of stuff. He always wanted to use real intestines as often as we could. You can't get better than the real thing. So we would use pig intestines. The big showstopper in Day of the Dead is when Rhodes is torn apart. The culmination of everything that we did in that movie led to that moment.
And then they just have a feast on his guts and on his body and his fingers and mostly the guts inside.
When we shot that scene, we used rancid, rotted intestines. And I remember a couple of the zombies actually took earplugs and stuffed them up their noses because the smell was so bad. When George yells, "Cut," everybody's doing this to wave the smell of the rotting intestines away from Joe Pilato's face. We didn't know any better to just go out and buy new guts. We didn't want to spend the $80, I guess. I don't know.
I think that the gore in Day of the Dead is actually very appropriate. It's over the top at the end, of course it is. That's George's humor. That's what was so remarkable about George's films. They get better and better with age.
Fright Night. If you love being scared, this could be the night of your life.
Hot off the success of his Psycho 2 screenplay, Tom Holland wrote and directed Fright Night and took everyone by surprise.
It left the great movie monsters behind, and I wrote Fright Night in reaction to that, and also because I had grown up loving the Hammer AIP vampire films. I love Christopher Lee.
It stars William Ragsdale, Amanda Beers, Stephen Jeffries, and Roddy McDowall opposite Chris Sarandon.
What you do is have a gonzo horror fan look out the window and see his next door neighbor, a vampire, chomping down on somebody. And then, of course, if he's a horror movie fan and running around saying, "Vampire, vampire next door," nobody's going to believe him.
He's a vampire.
A what?
You can't make the villain all bad. You have to have the ambivalence where there are saving graces to the villain to make him a three-dimensional character. He's been given eternal life, but he always loses the one he loves.
She's someone I knew a long time ago.
Roddy McDowall kills it as Peter Vincent, who's a B-movie horror host named after Peter Cushing and Vincent Price, and he's forced to take on the real deal.
It was a cool movie that actually had a sense of history as well. It had everything you wanted. There was great gore. There were hints of nostalgia with McDowall and that kind of hint towards the Hammer movies, you know.
I had the best effects crew extant in Hollywood at that moment, and Fright Night is full of in-camera effects.
There's that final scene where Charlie and Peter Vincent confront Jerry Dandridge in the basement and Amy gets in the way.
And she says, "Charlie, you told me that you'd save me."
You promised you wouldn't let him get me.
And then she comes back to him. And when she came back to him, I realized there was a huge scare that was there. And I went to Steve Johnson and I said, "Steve, give her a shark's mouth that'll scare the hell out of every kid." That it ends up being the definitive image on the one sheet and has become cosplay. Yes. Who knew?
The Return of the Living Dead.
Return of the Living Dead, I think, is such a great horror comedy because it never stops being horrifying, but it's so gut-bustingly funny.
I remember a very significant moment of watching Return of the Living Dead when they bring in the thing and it doesn't work. Because then everything you think you know is out the window. And it's one of the first maybe meta zombie movies that's playing with those expectations, where they take a moment to explain all the rules that they learned from watching Night of the Living Dead.
I thought you said if we destroyed the brain, it'd die. It worked in the movie! Well, it ain't working now, Frank. You mean the movie lied?
And then when those rules don't apply to the situation you're in, suddenly it becomes, very, anything could happen.
They weren't the mindless flesh eaters. They were fast, they were smart, they were not what you were expecting. They're killing the paramedics, they're killing the cops, and one of them gets on the CB radio and is like, "Send more cops! Send more cops!" And it's just hilarious because you've never seen that in a zombie movie before.
The Tarman scene, I remember looking at it and thinking I had no idea how they did it. Because something so specific is happening with the anatomy of that thing. It's just one of those accidentally iconic moments of horror with the design and with the actor and with the way he was carrying himself. It's an indelible image of 80s horror.
That woman corpse that they cut in half. It was made by a friend of mine, Tony Gardner, who has done Chucky for the last few movies. They tie her down and have this conversation with her. They say, "Why do you want brains?" And she says,
"It makes the pain go away."
That to me is one of the most horrifying concepts I've ever heard in a horror movie, and so hilarious at the same time. I find that movie fascinating.
Howling 2. It's not over yet.
What can I say about Howling 2? I can say that Christopher Lee apologized to me for being in it. I can say that whatever Philippe Mora was thinking, I don't think it probably got on film. It does have, however, Sybil Danning's dropping her dress 72 times during the end credits, which, that counts for something. The problem with Howling 2 is that it just doesn't make any sense, particularly in that it completely blows the ending of Howling 1, in which the newscaster turns into a werewolf in front of the entire TV audience, and then in Howling 2, nobody saw it. It's like, it must have been the lowest rated newscast in history. And it was shot in Transylvania or someplace like that. Freddie Main is in it. I mean, there are things about it that are interesting, but it just doesn't make any sense at all.
Silver Bullet. The last glimmering hope.
When Stephen King focuses on small town stories, that's what I loved as a fan.
Well, Silver Bullet was done by Dan Attias, who was one of my assistant directors. It's a werewolf picture. Another one of those movies, 80s movies with a kid hero. Yeah, it's a pretty affecting movie because because a lot of these movies, much like I Was a Teenage Werewolf was, are parables about adolescence. And Silver Bullet it fits into that category, I think, much more so than like something like The Howling or American Werewolf.
The Coreys were kind of everything in the 80s. Silver Bullet was my first time seeing Corey Haim in anything. And I just fell in love with that kid. And I thought there was something very special about him in that movie. And of course, Gary Busey, his Uncle Red, with all of his little Uncle Red-isms, Ta-da! And it made me scared of the dark again. Because there's something out there. Everett McGill as Reverend Lowe, it's such a great performance.
You meddling little shit!
And it's interesting to me that in that movie, he didn't even have to be the guy in the werewolf costume. But he did it because he was so method.
Reanimator. It will scare you to pieces.
I had no idea that Reanimator would become a cult classic.
We needed to find a way to separate our film from so many of the others because everyone was making horror films then. Basically, Lovecraft doing his version of Frankenstein. It's about someone who has a dream that's a very positive thing that turns awful.
You killed him!
No, I did not. I gave him life.
It's sort of like be careful what you wish for. The idea of bringing the dead back to life is something we all wish that we could do.
I like movies where the heads talk and the brain that wouldn't die. And I just think, there's something about that that's real horror to me. Herbert West, he's so full of himself.
You'll never get credit for my discovery. Who's going to believe a talking head? Get a job in a sideshow.
And yet we can't help but like him because he's so enthusiastic and he always makes a choice you didn't guess at.
I think the unsung power of Stewart is his storytelling ability. Stewart's gloriously outrageous. He just goes for it. It's big. and it's brave.
So we had to invent a female character for Reanimator, and we invented the Dean's daughter, Megan Halsey, that Barbara Crampton plays in the film. And this, of course, the scene that got all the attention is the scene in which we sometimes call it the head gives head scene. We knew that no one was going to do a scene like this.
It was a funny thing that they were doing, this, you know, this visual pun. And I thought, I can't turn this down because of this moment on screen that I'm going to have to do. If I knew then what I know now, I don't know if I would have been able to go through with what I went through on Reanimator. I mean, it was quite exploitive. It was really groundbreaking in a way.
That scene is still shocking and taboo.
The fortunate thing is it stopped before it really gets bad. It just goes right up to the edge there. There wouldn't be Reanimator without that damsel in distress like that. It just, we wouldn't be talking about it.
Stuart Gordon's maybe a signature achievement in horror is the ironic tone, the over-the-top pleasure of the horror, the fun of it. He brought a kind of an experience to Reanimator that showed that a cheap horror movie can be really good.
I honestly thought no one will ever see this bloody thing. What did I know?
Ash, played by Bruce Campbell, he was one of the first actors who became famous in horror for playing a hero rather than a villain. Horror stars from the 30s on down, you know, through to Vincent Price and Christopher Lee, etc., were tended to be known for playing the monsters, the villains. The male horror stars were known for being the antagonists, and Bruce Campbell was a little different.
He was the Bruce Willis of horror. He was just that everyman who was like stuck in a situation that was way out of his league. He just said, screw it, I'm not gonna die.
He was known for being the guy fighting back against the evil, so that made him kind of unique in horror history.
Every boy in the world must have wanted to be Kurt Russell in The Thing. He battles an alien creature in sub-zero temperatures.
Fuck you too!
He's still badass all the way through, even after everything he's been through.
Tom Holland's Fright Night. I always wanted to be like kind of a mix between Charlie Brewster and Evil Ed, where I wanted to be the super horror nerdy kid, but I also wanted the girlfriend.
Hey, Amy. Amy.
Phantasm 2. Reggie Bannister is a likable, relatable character because he's basically playing himself.
Come on. Let's go kick some ass.
He talks that way off set, you know, hey dude, man, how's it going? He's the same way. I think that's why people like him.
Tom Atkins is awesome.
He's always like a reliable presence. You see him turn up in a lot of Carpenter stuff, and then Romero borrows him for Creepshow, and then he's in Night of the Creeps as the cop. He's great.
Yeah.
Mo Rutherford from The Stuff, he is awesome. On first glance, you're like, this guy's kind of a scumbag and he plays himself a little like aloof, but then as the movie goes on, you really fall in love with him because you see where he's coming from.
I don't think you're quite as dumb as you appear to be.
No one is as dumb as I appear to be.
A lot of people will misunderstand him and think that he's the doofus, but really he's outsmarting everyone. He's such a good character.
So when I think of 80s specifically and heroes, I think of movies like The Monster Squad and The Lost Boys. These are movies that I could relate to as a kid. It's these cool kids that I wanted as my friends. I wanted that treehouse. I wanted that club. Like, I really wanted to have a monster club and ride around on my bike and try to actually take out monsters if I could find them, you know? In Lost Boys, you've got the Frog Brothers. They hung out at this comic shop and they were vampire killers. I was like, man, this is me. I've got my bike. After this movie, I'm gonna go ride around with my friends and try to recreate these things.
In the 80s, the central character, certainly Friday the 13th and Nightmare, Halloween, you started to see really strong women who start out to be victims possibly, but at some point it turns. They find a way to win the day. Some guy doesn't come in and save them.
Yeah, it was not a time for kick-ass guys. It was a time for kick-ass gals.
And it wasn't about women running away from fear. It was about women confronting it. The 80s was a great decade for women, and I think people just sort of misconstrued what horror was trying to say about female characters.
How mad at me are you?
So many people who look at the genre outside, they think it's just about victimizing women. And I think they think it's about, you know, basically living out these like lurid fantasies of violence against women. But for me, as a kid growing up, watching 80s horror, it was about watching women persevere.
Horror has a love-hate relationship with women. They glorify it, but at the same time, completely objectifying and, you know, slashing the girl in the nightgown. So there's something going on there. I don't know what it is. What is it?
I love Jamie Lee Curtis in the original Halloween. You think she's just a babysitter. Oh no.
She has a quality of both being tender and strong at the same time, and that's a very attractive combination, you know. How she became iconic, I think, is that, one, she survives. She's there to protect the young ones that she's in charge of. And she survives trying to save other people, too. She was very vulnerable, but still strong enough to fight back.
She was a fighter, and so that was also something to aspire to. But I can sort of hook into the idea of like, oh yeah, I'm a fighter too, and I can stand up for myself, and I can take care of myself, and I can, you know, I can be brave, you know. So there's a lot of that in there that I think is really cool for women and for everyone.
The beauty of being a woman in horror is you're an action figure. You're running, you're jumping, you're playing, you're proactive. You're taking command of plot situations and scenes that women in ordinary movies don't get to do.
For as much as people like to look down on, say, the Friday the 13th movies, when you really look at it, Friday 2 was about Ginny, and it was about Amy Steele being smarter than every other person at that camp. And she knew how to get into Jason's head. She knew how to defeat the monster, so to speak.
Jason, Mother is talking to you!
Barbara Crampton, the queen of low-budget horror throughout the 80s. She just came across as someone that's like really strong.
She goes from a traditional girlfriend role in Reanimador to the de facto protagonist of From Beyond. She becomes the seeker of that story, which is a pretty cool transition. Pretty emblematic of what Barbara has done with that legacy since, which is pretty cool to see.
Somebody like Nancy Thompson, who basically open arms at the end of Nightmare on Elm Street, is like, come get me, Freddy, let's do this.
And it was really Heather Langenkamp's movie. She was an amazing force in that movie, and that performance is really strong and one of the best renditions of the final girl ever.
She creates all these traps and she plans out how, you know, she's going to trap the killer. It's like some fucked up Home Alone style horror nightmare.
So she decides to lay the booby traps around her house using an army manual called Booby Traps and Anti-Personnel Devices. There's something so childlike about it that I love it. It's effective.
And you see that now in conventions, people dressing up as Nancy and drawing power from her. There's like a real serious thread of women who have survived PTSD and have survived sexual trauma and have gravitated to these heroes. It makes perfect sense. It's amazing.
If you look at something like Hellraiser with Kirsty, her whole family life is just one big Shakespearean mess, you know, between Julia and her Uncle Frank and her father. But in the end, it's her resilience that ends up sending the Cenobites back.
Are you going to be the type that
does the wrong thing and makes the wrong decision, or are you going to buckle down and think it through and be a leader?
We're the Monster Squad.
And I think those are our heroes and our heroines, and that's who you remember. You remember the final person or the final girl or the final hero or the heroine. That's the leader that made a struggle, came through, but these are all just iconic hero stories anyway. This is just our new literature.
The 80s were about the people surviving the monster, and somehow or another that got twisted around where the monster's the star and the people were incidental. And that's what the term final girl reared its head. And it makes me sound like I'm 100 years old, but I said, you know, in my day, we called that the star of the movie.
It's almost like we had to qualify making these women the protagonists of the movie by saying, well, we're adhering to this formula, and she's the final girl, and she's a scream queen. But really what you've got is a genre full of women protagonists, which is pretty cool. So much so that when it's a guy, like Jesse in Elm Street 2 or Charlie in Fright Night, it's almost an aberration.
Scream queen, final girl, it's just fan shorthand. It doesn't really mean anything to me. My gender is specific. I am a woman. I love living my life as a woman. I love living my life in horror films as a woman because the decisions and the instincts and the actions I take are predicated on my gender. I don't act like a guy and I don't want to. The fact that I'm physical, that I'm sexual, that I'm intellectual, that I'm spiritual, all of those things are grounded in the fact that I'm a woman. So I don't necessarily want equality of public perception or public acceptance.
When I think about the term final girl, I wince because it's still differentiating between a final boy and a final girl. We're going to be judged about how we fought the monster and not because of the gender that we were when we fought him. Wes Craven was brave, maybe, to have a girl be his lead, but I don't think anybody would give him any credit for it today. Equal opportunity ass-kicking is what I'm all for.
The openness of what gender means now is so wonderful. Is how fluid it is and how people don't want to be identified by gender. I'm so curious how this will play out in film in the horror genre.
I look forward to seeing more transgendered, more LGBTQ figures in horror and what they will bring that will really bring an entirely new dimension to horror movies. That's what's going to be exciting. I want to see that.